So today I'm going to do another fun video where I'm going to take a look at the last 10 seasons and look at all the teams that finished dead last in the standings of each of the conference and see how they do the very next year. Because as much as there is this notion of finish dead last in the table means next year it's going to be just as miserable as the year it is, or you don't make a lot of jump. That is actually not always true. And there are teams, especially during the mid-2010s, where we saw teams that were finished dead last in the standings only to make the playoffs in the very next year. And we even had one extreme cases where, you know that old saying, you can maybe sometime from going from finishing dead last to finish first place the very next season. We actually had that case happen once, and I think that might be the only time we have seen that. Well, actually, no, that's not true, because I've just realized that we've seen that a couple of times in the early days of MLS, but we'll talk about which team, of course, were able to finish dead last in one year, only to finish top in the very next season. So we start off with 2012, and again, I'm going to look at the last 10 seasons. So we start with 2012 in the Western Conference. The team that finished dead last is Chivas USA. Remember them? The team that was always known as the butts of MLS, and the team that is kind of no longer exists in the league. Well, they finished dead last in 2012, and unfortunately in the very next season, they pretty much finished that same position too, in ninth place, which is dead last back then when the Western Conference only had 19. And then on the Eastern Conference, we had Toronto FC, and this was before, Jovico Altidore and his gang basically made the team to be a superpower in the Eastern Conference. They finished dead last that season in 2012, and the very next year, although they finished in the same position as Chivas USA, there was 10 teams in the Eastern Conference, and they just barely were able to once again finish another season in the bottom of the Eastern Conference and finish ninth in the standings. So we move to 2013, where once again Chivas USA finished dead last in the standings, but the very next season they actually came close of making the playoffs. Like, they finished in 7th in the playoffs, and I think back then the top 6 team, of course, would make it to the playoffs. But then we get to the Eastern Conference, and this is where I talked about earlier, where the old saying you can go from dead last to first. Well, it happened. DC United, who of course finished dead last in 2013. And what's also weird about that season for DC is that despite the fact that they finished dead last in the standing, they still won some silverware. I mean, I think that's probably the only time we have ever seen a team that finished rock bottom in their standings and they still get to say that they won some silverware with the way that they won the U.S. Open Cup that year. And then the very next year, they kind of proved to the fact that they weren't just a good team in the U.S. Open Cup. They actually were a good team overall, as the next season, they finished at the top of the Eastern Conference in 2014. Now, moving to 2014, it was the San Jose Earthquakes finishing dead last that season. And then the very next year, they came close of making the playoffs, finished 7th in the standings. I think they were like 4 points away from making the playoffs, and 4 points behind Sporting KC of just missing out on the playoffs. And then you got Montreal, who of course finished dead last in the Eastern Conference in 2014, but the very next year they actually finished 3rd and make it to the playoffs. And this is where you start to see teams where just because you finish dead last in a season doesn't mean you're not going to make the playoffs the very next year. And also to give one note about Montreal, I think that the very next season was the year when they start having the likes of Didier Drogba being on that team, and then they started to build really solid team that made a good run for these next couple of years. But nevertheless, in 2015, the Colorado Rapids find themselves hitting rock bottom, but the very next year they finished 2nd in the Western Conference. I remember that was the team where, during the offseason they signed Tim Howard, and they signed a really good back line, and that the very next season, the reason why they finished near the top of the standings was because they just had such a good defense. Like, that was probably one of the best defensive team we have ever seen in MLS history, and that team also came just one win away from reaching MLS Cup and only falling to the Seattle Sounders in the Western Conference. And then we get to the Chicago Fire, who, of course, also I believe this was the first year when the Wooden Spoon, of course, was awarded. So, now before that, I don't think there was an actual Wooden Spoon trophy that was awarded. But the Chicago Fire gets the dubious honor of being the first ever winner of the Anthony Precourt Memorial Wooden Spoon by finishing dead last in that standing, and they would actually get back-to-back year of winning the Wooden Spoon, because the very next year, not only the fact that they finished last again in the Eastern Conference, but they once again win the Wooden Spoon. Now, the very next year in 2016, it was the Dynamo, the team that hit rock bottom, but the very next season, they actually finished fourth in the standings and actually made it to the playoffs. And just like the Colorado Rapids, where not only the fact that they made it to the playoffs, but they also made it all the way to the Western Conference Final, also falling to the eventual winner, the Seattle Sounders, in that Western Conference Final. Whereas on the other end, you got the Chicago Fire, of course, finished dead last in the last 2 years, but the very next year they actually finished third in the standings, and I think that was the first year, or that was the off season when they got Bastian Schweinsteiger, and there was a lot of hype about him and how he really turned that team well. And not to also mention the fact that they also got Dax McCarty, and Dax McCarty was definitely was a catalyst in terms of that Fire team making the playoffs and really be a team that almost looked like the old Chicago Fire that we know that they were always very good at in the early 2000s and the late 90s. Then you got in 2017, and it's hard to believe, but the Galaxy actually did finish rock bottom in 1 year. And for Galaxy fans that complain about how their team is being bad, I don't think they kind of remember, or at least they kind of forgot about how bad 2017 is. Like, 2017 was really the rock bottom moment for this historic franchise, as they finished dead last that season. But the very next year, they came just one place from making the playoffs. Although I remember that was the time when they were playing against the Houston Dynamo, aka the team that they must really hate playing against, because it's literally like their bogey team, especially on decision day, because they suffer a loss in that game, and basically they were knocked out of the playoffs. And not to mention that same off season, when after they finished dead last in the standings, they signed Zlatan to their team, and yet they still weren't able to make it to the playoffs, which that's kind of equally as embarrassing as finish rock bottom, considering you literally just signed one of the best player in the world, or arguably the best player in the world, and you still yet to fail to make it to the playoffs. Then we got DC United once again finding themselves dead last in the Eastern Conference, and the very next season, although they didn't once again repeat the feat that they did in 2013, at least they make it to the playoffs again. And speaking of big players, during that offseason they signed Wayne Rooney, and I think that was also the year when Lucho Acosta finally came to the good, and we saw that Lucha kind of connection, and it guided them all the way to fourth place. And not to mention they had an incredible home stretch, where I think that was the first year when Audi Field was open, and Audi Field was an absolute fortress. Like, DC rarely lost at home during that season, and they just kind of run the table and make it to the playoffs as the fourth seed. Then in 2018, I don't really need to explain what happened in 2018, especially of how miserable that year was for the San Jose Earthquakes. By far the worst year in franchise history. But the very next year, they finished 8th in the standing, just missed out on the playoffs on the final day of the season when they lost to the Portland Timbers in a game where that was kind of the winner-take-all kind of game, because both teams had to win in order to, well, actually the Timbers didn't need to win, but in the spirit of a winner-take-all game, you can say that both teams need to win to make it to the playoffs. And that was also the season after they finished dead last. They hired Mateus Almeida as their head coach, and things kind of gone okay, but once again it was another heartbreaking end for the Quakes the very next year, missing out on the playoffs by losing on decision day against the Portland Timbers. Then on the other end, you got Orlando City finished dead last in the standings, and this is back when Orlando City was still considered the joke of the Eastern Conference, and the team that just couldn't really get things going in their first couple of years of existence. And then the very next year, things didn't really get any better as they finished 11th in the Eastern Conference, which I believe that was second to dead last in the standings. Then the very next year, you got the Vancouver Whitecaps finished bottom of the Western Conference. But the very next year, just like the previous two teams I mentioned, they barely missed the playoffs. Like, they finished 9th in the standings, which, during that 2020 year, also known as the COVID short year, they almost got to the 8th seed. And they could also make the argument the fact that it was kind of unfair in terms of the way that the season kind of ended in a points per game total. Though, you know, when you also look at how the season, of course, went, it really doesn't matter if you look at the points total or the points per game standing, because it's pretty much still the same. They still would have missed out on the playoffs. And then this is where we get to the misery of FC Cincinnati. I mean, I probably should have worn an FC Cincinnati jersey when I did this video, because yeah, this is when they kind of start a little misery dynasty where they win their first ever wooden spoon in their inaugural year by finishing dead last in the standings, and then the very next year they would make it 2 in a row to win the wooden spoon. Then moving into 2020, we got the Houston Dynamo finishing dead last in the standings, and then the very next year they should finish dead last again. And in fact, I think this season was probably the first time in MLS history where two teams that finished dead last in the previous season finished dead last again in the very next season. I mean, I swear, I don't think that has ever happened. Although I will say that it came close in 2012 with the way that TFC almost finished dead last, and we almost had the same team finishing dead last as it was the case in the previous season. But yeah, as I mentioned, the Dynamo finished dead last in 2020. They would finish dead last again in 2021. And then FC Cincinnati make it 2 wooden spoon in a row where they finish dead last before finishing once again dead last and make it 3 wooden spoon in a row. And again, kind of create that dynasty of being one of the most miserable, if not the most miserable franchise in MLS right now. So we now move to 2021, which is present day, and of course we won't know exactly where these teams would finish in terms of how last season of these teams finished bottom of the Western Conference, because, you know, I don't have a time machine. I can't travel in the future to know what's going to happen with the team. Although I will say that I don't think next year we're going to have the same 2 teams finish dead last in the standings. Mainly because, you know, the Houston Dynamo is a team that with a new front office and a new GM and Pat Onstead, I think he's going to do good things and not really guide this team yet to be a playoff contender, but be a respectable team. And then of course FC Cincinnati pretty much just taking any Philadelphia Union kind of front office member and trying to use the Union way to get themselves out of the doldrum of the Eastern Conference and really kind of the doldrum of the league and finally be a respectable team. But yeah, there you have it. That is pretty much it for looking at all these teams that finished dead last in their standings and how they do the very next year. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? I might actually maybe do a video later on talk about all the teams that finished first in each conference and see how they did in the very next year, because I think I can say that there are maybe some teams that I know that finished first in the conference, and then the very next year, yeah, things really kind of went south. But let me know in the comments below if you wanted me to do that video, and let me know in the comments below what do you think of this video. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.